Ooh, chapter 4 and alright, let's keep going. Consider the definition of a tragedy. Were we to cut straight to the chase, we would say that the word denoted the concept of loss. Loss of what people held dear opened a hole in their hearts. Was not an event that drove cracks in the heart and rifts in the mind not generally referred to as a tragedy? Yet what people individually considered important rivaled the stars themselves in number and diversity. Although friends, families, lovers, and the like were generally held in the highest regard by most, I knew all too well that some would feel not a speck of emotion, yet not a single tear upon their loss. Then how were we to define tragedy so it applied to all? In a certain book it is written that it was hardly what one lost. Hold on, let me grab a drink. Okay. In a certain book, it was written that it was hardly what one lost that ought to matter, but rather the circumstances surrounding the loss. That having something broken or stolen was far greater a tragedy than simply misplacing it. Was that really true? In tragedies with a clear perpetrator, anger made for an easy way out. The sorrow of the tragedy might be forgotten through hatred of the thief, and could even grant one's life a goal in the form of revenge. Could such a thing truly be labeled tragedy in its purest form? I knew it was tough. That was a matter of even someone as ordinary as me could comprehend, yet I would have preferred to plunge deeper into the subject. Man's psyche was a clever construct. It pulled a safety valve the moment it found itself assaulted by a storm of deeply negative emotions. Anger and sorrow would turn into pleasure, and if it exceeded that, indifference. The heart and mind attempted to regain their balance in some shape or form, and wounds were healed, albeit in a twisted manner. With that in mind, the unclosing fissure, the unhealing, ever-bleeding wound born of tragedy, what could such a thing denote? If indeed that was possible, then surely it would become a being denied from birth the right to possess a single thing, its grasp empty. As it was unable to take hold of anything, neither was it capable of losing it. A being that was born deficient and would consequently never heal, an eternally lost child. I had dreamt of one such girl, and the cruel tale of her birth. France, 1793. There was once a married couple who lived in Saint Malo of Brittany. The husband was a well-built dockhand, his wife a beautiful woman of fair disposition. They were leading what one could easily label a joyous life. The fierce storm of the revolution's ideology ushered in a violent shift in the citizens' way of thinking. The clergy and nobility were soon established as absolute evil, and the married couple, without questioning that judgment, accepted it as truth, indulging in blind, foolish hatred. They failed to remember that, in their time of youth, it was a certain priest's assistance that eventually brought them their current bliss. It was a clergyman, and therefore evil in the husband's mind. This plain and simple conclusion remained irrefutable. His wife was a devout Republican, even more zealous than he. So devout, in fact, that she would station herself at the foot of a guillotine hours before an execution, busying herself with knitting as she watched the heads fall. Even as she was heavy with child, and in the later stages of pregnancy, she would nonetheless make her way to the gallows every single day without fail. The husband, her knight in shining armor, would continue to escort his lovely wife to her special seat day after day. This is fucked up. The blade of the guillotine fell. Heads rolled. Blood, blood, blood. It wanted blood. After thoroughly enjoying that festival of madness, the two would make their way home whilst discussing the future of their soon-to-be-born child. They were joyous, blessed couple. They were upstanding citizens, their sense of values typical of all respectable townsfolk during that era. However, one day during the Macedour, the harvest festival, Saint Malo came to hold an execution of particular interest. The victim was a former pastor in the Church of Christ. The aged clergyman was well known among the townsfolk, and as such, everyone wished to see his expression as he rose to the gallows. Naturally, the good married couple was no exception. The wife stood with the crowd at the foot of the guillotine, her body racked with the intense pains of labor, yet she stifled her screams with heroic effort, waiting in anticipation for the moment the priest would climb the scaffold. The aged pastor was a father figure to the poor and needy, holy man who earned their love and admiration, and yet he was the enemy, figure of wickedness, deserving punishment. His head needed to fall, and yet on that day the executioner was nowhere to be found. Ah, such misfortune. The wife moaned with disappointment. Perhaps the executioner had fled at the idea of executing a priest of such virtue and benevolence. The Republican officials called for a new executioner from the crowd, yet the onlookers' hearts were so filled with sympathy for the elderly priest that none of them dared step forward. Were things to stay this way, the execution would be cancelled. My love, I beg of you. Despite being shaken by violent pain, the wife clung desperately onto her husband's sleeve. To the foolishly naive man, her action was no less than a supreme command. I shall do it. The wife, watching the gallant figure of her husband ascend the steps to the scaffold, raised her voice and broke into a beloved song of hers. Blood, 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 wants blood. Shower the guillotine with drink. May the guillotine's thirst be quenched. What it wants is blood, blood, blood. Like magic, that familiar tune dispelled all sympathy from the crowd's hearts in an instant. A certain kind of joy spread from person to person like an infectious disease as the vile, bloodthirsty refrain echoed, its words sweeping across the execution site. Blood, blood, blood. It wants blood. Shower the guillotine with drink. May the guillotine's thirst be quenched. What it wants is blood, blood, blood. Surrounded by blessings, the husband proved his love toward his wife, as well as loyalty to his country, by beheading his very own benefactor. It was an honor, a commendable act, hardly worthy of shame. And so, as he returned to his wife's side and beheld the female newborn in her arms, he wept tears of joy. This child was born on a day of celebration. God has a duty to make her happy. Indeed, God would see to it. Look how lovely she is. I'm certain everyone will be entranced with her. Indeed, no one would forget her. Marguerite, the jewel of Saint Malo, the child damned at birth, the girl born at the foot of a guillotine. She came into this world with a mark resembling a guillotine scar around her neck, one that would never fade. Even as she passed her 10th year, she was still unable to speak. When she finally did open her mouth, what left her lips was the guillotine's refrain. Her mother went insane and died a mad woman. Her father was loathed as a murderer and met his end under the guillotine for charges of smuggling. But the girl herself harbored no sins of her own. She had never done anything wrong. For the child to suffer due to parental sin, that was but another facet of an ever-cruel world of injustice. Silent most of the time, the girl would only recite the guillotine's bloody refrain every time she opened her mouth. The moment she set foot outside, the entire town will fall into an ominous silence. Her tragic madness, the cruelty of her birth. Having grown up amidst fear, loathing, hatred, and isolation, the girl lost everything before she ever came to possess a single thing in life. Though she was healthy in mind, her dysfunctional feelings could not comprehend the meaning of sorrow. And so, her case was what one could call tragedy. A girl thoroughly abnormal, a complete outcast. There were many who plotted to bring harm upon fair Marguerite, yet all who touched her ended up decapitated without exception. She was under the guillotine's protection. Her curse would kill anyone that dared touch her. If we assumed beauty to be fleeting and fragile, in constant danger of being trampled on, then her beauty was indeed no beauty at all. And yet, neither was she hideous, but a vacant, empty void. Eternity itself. Following her parents' death, she roamed the streets aimlessly like a discarded animal, mindless of what to eat or where to sleep, yet never tiring, never decaying. She is no human. Hardly could we fault anyone for saying that. It was a logical conclusion of the matter. Cliched as it may have been, she was inevitably declared a witch, for she was inhuman and abnormal, with over 100 already having perished after touching her. Her life could not be allowed. Her past needed to be buried. And, in the end, Marguerite was arrested and hauled off to the gallows. No one could touch her. Her treatment resembled the handling of a dangerous instrument. The process itself similar to herding sheep. Yet, Marguerite did not resist. Had she set her heart on it, she could have slaughtered her captors with ease. So, why did she choose not to? The answer was quite simple. The meaning of death and execution lay beyond her comprehension. To her, decapitation was a common occurrence. Whether it was her own head that fell or someone else's, she could not tell the difference. And so on that day, she stood at the gallows, the very same place that once witnessed her father's gruesome duty, the place of her birth. Gazing into the faraway sunset, Marguerite, with a heart pure and untainted, began her song. The refrain of blood, the hymn of the guillotine, singing God's curse like a prayer. Those were her first, and as many had thought, final words spoken as a human being. But at that moment, Marguerite had an epiphany. The words remained eternally burned into their ears. The soul of a man, watching the spectacle for no particular reason amongst the crowd, was torn out of its very foundations. He was none other than Ahasver, vagrant known as Saint Germain, in another time as Paracelsus, Paracelsus, or as Faust, Rosencrantz, or even Magnus. This man, currently known as Alessandro di Cagliostro, was swept away by her very being. She alone remained free from the law of this universe, an exquisite soul not bound by the shackles of eternal recurrence, one that would stay in the same place even after death. If such is the case, I will move every fiber of my being to save her. I shall kneel before her, reducing my very being to that of a slave. For the princess of the guillotine was a beauty transcending words. Gifting her with an appropriate necklace is my utmost, and thus her sentence was carried out. Marguerite's life came to an end. However, the jewel of Saint Malo lost not a shred of its luster. She had been born with nothing to begin with. As such, not even the loss of her life could grant her death. Yet ever since then, she had been all alone, singing endlessly in that eternal twilight even to this very day. She sang the abominable refrain like an angel, her voice pure and rife with bittersweet beauty. I found myself angered. I wished to seethe with anger in her place, a girl who knew neither sorrow nor tears. If I didn't do so, no one ever would. and that thought alone felt beyond unbearable. I knew this to be hypocrisy on my part. I should have been minding my own business, but my heart ached at Marie's life. Why did this girl have to go through all that? What did she ever do wrong? If there was a god out there, he would need to be cursed in her stead.
やっぱりカリオストロとよく似ていますね。
We both found ourselves entranced by a girl feared and loathed by all.
あなたはあの人の代わりなんでしょ?
I couldn't deny that, no matter how much I wanted to.
ね、私の愛しい人。
How deeply did she comprehend the meaning behind those words?
これからは一緒。
Having borne witness to our origins, I could now focus on the battles that would no doubt await us both.
ああ、一緒だ。
There was no way I could have rejected Marie, and so I took her hand. Packed fords of sympathy, selfishness, and truth, I found myself stung with guilt. Just like that bastard, I wanted to save her, but the only way I could do that was by using her as a lethal weapon. A Kabara dilemma. So that said, I found myself imagining just how wonderful it would be if I could give Marie a second chance at life once all this was done and over with. Chapter 5 Holiday.